One night in the late 1960s, a maitre d' at a restaurant in Brooklyn poured wine on a woman's dress, and then made the mistake of trying to wipe it off with a dirty rag from his own apron. The woman was Phyllis Vario. Her husband was sitting across the table. He flipped the table over, got in one or two swings before the kitchen staff blocked him off with pans and knives, and walked out without another word. He came back that night after closing with a crew of men carrying baseball bats and pipes. They didn't rob the place. They didn't torch it. They just beat every employee they could find, methodically, and left. One of the men swinging a bat that night was a 20-something kid named Henry Hill, who later said the whole thing felt almost administrative. No debate, no speech, just a decision that got carried out. That kind of night happened often enough that the men around him stopped asking why. Vario didn't explain his decisions, and he rarely repeated himself. He gave an order once, watched to see whether it got done, and adjusted his opinion of a man based entirely on the answer. That style of leadership is part of why his crew held together for as long as it did. Through prison terms, through a federal wiretap operation, through the eventual collapse of half his own inner circle. The man who gave that order never appears in a single violent scene in Goodfellas. He sits at the head of the table. He eats. He listens. He hands out small favors and small punishments in a voice that never rises. Paul Sorvino plays him as a patient, almost fatherly presence, the guy who keeps the peace between louder, more dangerous men. That is Paulie Cicero. The real man he's based on, Paul Vario, was described by federal prosecutors as one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in New York City. He ran a piece of the Lucchese crime family that touched loan sharking, hijacking, bookmaking, labor racketeering, and murder, and he did it for close to 50 years without ever losing control of the men underneath him. Henry Hill, the guy the whole movie is told through, wasn't running that world. He was one earner inside it, chosen by Vario as a kid and kept close for exactly that reason. This is Vario's story, told from his side of the table, and it connects directly to what happened to Karen Hill while her husband was locked up, because Vario is the man who was in her house. Paul Vario was born on July 10, 1914, and grew up in the Old Mill section of South Brooklyn, a working-class Italian neighborhood that fed young men into organized crime the way other neighborhoods fed them into the docks or the factories. He was already in trouble by the time he was 11 years old. In 1925, a court sent him to a juvenile facility for 7 months over truancy, which sounds minor until you realize it was the first entry in a criminal record that would eventually run for 6 decades. By 1937, Vario and an associate named Anthony Romano were convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to 10 years. He was paroled twice during that sentence, and both times he was sent back for violating the terms, once for burglary, once for handling stolen property. He didn't walk free again until 1962, at age 48, and that's when his real career inside the Lucchese family began. Almost 50 years old, with 2 prison terms and a juvenile record behind him, most men in that position would have been considered finished, too old and too marked to build anything new. Vario used the years he had left to build something more durable than anything he'd run in his 20s. He understood, in a way a lot of louder mobsters never grasped, that longevity in that business came from staying invisible to prosecutors rather than staying feared on the street. Fear was easy. Every capo in Brooklyn had fear. What Vario built instead was a structure that could survive his own arrest, because it never depended on any single asset that could be seized or any single witness who could testify to ownership. He came out of prison bigger than he went in, 6'3" and somewhere north of 250 pounds, and people who knew him described a man who didn't need to raise his voice because his size did the talking. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear the kind of suits that got a man's photograph in the paper. He ran his operation out of a trailer inside a junkyard he owned in Canarsie, and out of a cab stand in a pizzeria on Pine Street that his brother Vito, known as Tutty, managed for him. Vario had one rule he repeated constantly, according to people who worked under him. Never put your name on anything. No paperwork, no property, nothing a prosecutor could point to and say this belongs to Paul Vario. It's part of why it took federal investigators the better part of 2 decades to build a case that actually stuck. The cab stand sat directly across the street from a row house where an 11-year-old half-Irish, half-Sicilian kid named Henry Hill lived with his family. Hill started hanging around the stand doing small jobs, parking cars, running food, picking up dry cleaning, and Vario noticed him. Because Hill wasn't fully Italian, he could never be never sworn into the family as a full member. That limitation is exactly what made him useful to Vario. A made man owes his first loyalty to the family structure above his own capo. An earner who can never be made owes his loyalty to whichever capo brought him in and keeps him fed. Vario picked Hill specifically because Hill's ceiling was fixed. He would never outrank his sponsor, never sit on a panel that judged him, never have standing to challenge him. Vario paid him well, taught him the rackets, and introduced him to the two other men who would define his life. Tommy DeSimone, a teenage hothead with a talent for violence that even other killers found excessive, and James "Jimmy" Burke, an Irish associate who would go on to orchestrate the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. The real center of Vario's income wasn't the pizzeria or the cab stand. It was Idlewild Airport, renamed JFK in 1963, sitting a short drive from his home turf in East New York. Vario's crew had spent years building relationships inside the cargo haulers union, and that gave him something more valuable than any single robbery: advanced knowledge of what was on which truck, when it left the terminal, and which routes it would take. Hijacking crews under Vario hit trucks loaded with everything from cigarettes to consumer electronics to, in one case that made it into a federal indictment, a shipment of women's slacks worth $44,000. Henry Hill later described the airport as the crew's personal bank, a place they could walk into and withdraw money whenever the operation needed cash. FBI wiretaps in later years picked up Lucchese members bragging that the family effectively owned JFK. That wasn't an exaggeration built for a movie. It was a description of an actual, sustained hold over one of the busiest transportation hubs in the country, built patiently over years and never once tied on paper to Vario's name. People remember the Lufthansa heist because it was one night, one score, and a number that made headlines. Close to $6 million in cash and jewelry, the largest cash robbery in the country's history at the time. What people forget is that Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone spent the following months getting picked off one by one, murdered by their own partners to keep the crew from talking, until almost nobody connected to that single job was left standing. Vario never touched the Lufthansa cash and never needed to. His crew's loan sharking, bookmaking, and hijacking operations produced a steady weekly return that, by Henry Hill's own account, could rival what Burke's men pulled out of that one warehouse, week after week, without a single body turning up to draw federal attention. A one-time score gets you a headline. A standing weekly take off a union you control gets you 50 years in the same business. That patience extended to how he handled law enforcement. In April 1972, investigators wired a detective and sent him into Vario's junkyard to build a relationship. Vario, convinced the officer could be bought, started offering him bribes over the following months, unaware the whole exchange was being recorded. The surveillance ran roughly 6 months before police finally raided the junkyard that October. What followed was less a single prosecution than an avalanche. In less than 2 months, Vario was hit with a witness tampering indictment for advising a gambler to flee the state rather than testify, an insurance fraud indictment tied to a boat his crew had deliberately sunk and then filed a false claim on, and a bribery indictment for the very officer he'd been trying to buy off. When police finally came to arrest him, he led them on a 20-minute car chase through Brooklyn before pulling over. The bribery charge wasn't an isolated slip. Vario had spent years operating on the assumption that enough money handed to enough people in uniform would keep his operation a step ahead of any real investigation, and for a long stretch of his career that assumption held. Court records and later reporting described payments made to officers willing to look the other way on gambling operations and tip off the crew before raids. It's why the 1972 sting stung so much. The Bureau hadn't just caught him committing a crime. It had caught him doing the one thing his entire business model depended on, trying to buy a badge, and this time the badge was wired for sound. By February 1973, he'd also been convicted of tax evasion for failing to report tens of thousands of dollars in gambling income, and in April he was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He served roughly 2, walked out in 1975, and slid straight back into the Lucchese hierarchy as an underboss under the family's new leader, Anthony Corallo. It's worth sitting with how ordinary that period was for Vario. A 6-year federal sentence would end most careers in organized crime. For him, it was a pause. He came home to the same crew, the same rackets, and the same standing inside the family because the operation had never depended on his personal presence at street level. It depended on relationships he'd spent decades building and never wrote down anywhere. Henry Hill's own legal troubles gave Vario the opening for the part of this story that the movie treats almost as a footnote. When Hill went to prison on extortion charges, his wife Karen was left on her own with 2 young children and a husband on the inside. Vario, who had known Karen for years and treated Henry like something close to a son, began an affair with her while Henry was locked up. It wasn't hidden particularly well, and it wasn't treated by anyone in that world as a betrayal in the way an affair between equals might be. Vario was the boss. Karen was the wife of one of his earners. The imbalance of power was the entire point, and everyone around them understood it that way, including Henry once he found out. Understand what that arrangement actually meant inside that world. A capo sleeping with an earner's wife wasn't scandal in the way it would be anywhere else. It was a demonstration. It told every man under Vario, without a word ever being said out loud, exactly how much of their lives belonged to him and exactly how little say they had in the matter. Henry could be angry about it. He could resent it privately for years, the way he apparently did. What he could not do was confront Vario directly, because confronting Vario meant confronting the entire structure that put money in his pocket and kept him breathing. That's the dynamic Karen's video walked you through from inside her own house, watching her husband go quiet whenever the subject came up. This is the same dynamic from the other end of it, a boss who understood exactly what the affair communicated and used it anyway, because control was never separate from the rackets for a man like Vario. It was the product itself. The same stretch of time produced the incident that would eventually cost Tommy DeSimone his life, though it took years to fully play out. DeSimone attempted to rape Karen, an assault that Henry Hill later described as one of the moments that convinced him his old friend had become something closer to a total psychopath than a criminal associate. It sat alongside a growing list of problems DeSimone had created for the family, problems that had nothing to do with loyalty to Karen and everything to do with a much older and more dangerous debt. That debt went back to 1970, when DeSimone killed a Gambino family-made man named William Billy Batts, bent vena after Batts needled him about his years as a low-ranking associate. Killing a made man without the commission's approval is one of the few rules in that world that gets enforced without exception, and DeSimone had done it on his own initiative, with no sign-off from anyone above him. He killed at least 2 more people that same year, added a Gambino associate named Ronald Foxy Giroux to the list in 1974 after a personal dispute, and in 1978 killed Pernell Stax Edwards, a member of the crew behind the Lufthansa heist, for the almost unbelievable mistake of leaving the getaway truck parked in plain view instead of destroying it as instructed. By the end of the 1970s, DeSimone had become a walking liability. 2 of his own brothers were tied to the Gambino family, and one of them had turned informant, which meant the DeSimone name itself had become radioactive on both sides of the Brooklyn-Queens line. None of this happened in isolation from Vario's own interests. Every murder DeSimone committed without approval was, technically, a liability sitting on the books of the crew he belonged to, which meant it was sitting on Vario's books. A capo is responsible for the men under him in ways that go beyond loyalty. If DeSimone's recklessness eventually triggered a war with the Gambino family, that war would cost Vario men, money, and standing with the commission, regardless of whether he'd personally ordered any of it. He'd spent his career avoiding exactly that kind of exposure. Keeping DeSimone around had become, by 1978, a bet against the house, and Vario wasn't a man who liked leaving bets open longer than he had to. Everyone in that world eventually pays for the debts they've stacked up, and DeSimone's stack had been sitting untouched for close to a decade because the Gambinos were waiting for the right moment and the right authorization. That authorization is where Vario made the calculation that this video is really about. According to Henry Hill's later testimony, Vario met with Gambino representatives and gave his consent for DeSimone to be killed. On paper, the justification was the unsanctioned murder of Billy Batts, a debt that had been sitting on the books since 1970. In practice, it solved several problems for Vario at once. It settled a long-standing obligation to a rival family without costing him a man he actually needed. It removed an associate who had assaulted the woman he was involved with. And it happened without Vario ever having to lift a hand himself or absorb any of the blowback because the trigger, whoever pulled it, belonged to the Gambinos. That's the calculation worth sitting with because it tells you more about how Vario actually operated than any of the hijackings or the bribery indictments. He didn't solve the DeSimone problem the way a man like Jimmy Burke might have, fast and personal and messy. He waited nearly a decade, let the debt accumulate interest, and then cashed it in at the exact moment it also solved the second problem for him, the one sitting in his own bed. One conversation with the right people erased an old obligation to a rival family, removed a man who'd assaulted a woman he cared about, and cost him nothing because he never had to be in the room when it happened. Nobody in Goodfellas shows you that math. The film gives you a tense scene at a bar where Tommy is told he's finally getting made, and then a closed coffin. It never shows you the man 3 phone calls removed from the trigger, running the numbers on who benefits. DeSimone was told, near the end of 1978, that he was finally going to be made, a ceremony he'd been chasing his entire adult life. The night it was supposed to happen, the men who were meant to vouch for him and drive him to the ceremony called it off, citing bad weather. Jimmy Burke, according to Hill's account, took a phone call about it in a booth, listened, and then slammed the receiver down hard enough to shake the glass. On January 14, 1979, DeSimone's wife Angela reported him missing, telling police she'd last seen him weeks earlier when he'd borrowed $60 from her. He was never seen again. There was no funeral because there was no body. Some accounts place his remains in a mob dumping ground near JFK, close to the same runways his crew had spent years robbing. A separate and less certain account has him disposed of in a Philadelphia scrap yard and melted down in an industrial furnace along with a car. Neither has ever been confirmed. He was declared legally dead in 1990, 11 years after he vanished, and to this day nobody has recovered a single trace of him. Vario's own ending came from the same source that gave Karen Hill her exit from that world. Henry Hill was arrested again in 1980, this time on narcotics trafficking charges serious enough that Vario himself was reportedly furious with him for dealing drugs against the family's own rules. Facing real time and convinced Vario would have him killed rather than protect him, Hill made the same calculation every informant in this genre eventually makes. He flipped, entered witness protection with Karen and their children, and spent the next several years handing federal prosecutors the details of a criminal operation he'd been part of since he was 11 years old. The convictions that followed were methodical rather than dramatic. In 1984, Hill's testimony that Vario had arranged a fraudulent job offer to help spring him early from a prior sentence led to a fraud conviction and a 4-year term. In 1985, additional testimony helped secure an extortion conviction that added another 10 years. Vario was in his early 70s by then, and the sentences amounted to a life term delivered in installments. He died on May 3, 1988, of respiratory arrest at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, 73 years old, still serving time on a case built almost entirely from the memory of a kid he'd picked off a Brooklyn street corner 60 years earlier. He's buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, not far from the neighborhoods his crew had run for half a century. Set that against what Goodfellas actually shows you. Paulie Cicero hosts big Sunday dinners. He mentors Henry with something that plays, on screen, almost like genuine warmth. His violence happens off camera, implied rather than shown, and by the time the film ends he's an old man doing time, a fading authority figure rather than the architect of everything that happened to the people around him. It's a fair adaptation of a character built for a 2-hour runtime. It is not a fair account of what Paul Vario actually was, which was the one constant in a criminal operation that outlasted 2 federal prison terms, a citywide airport hijacking racket, an affair with his earner's wife, and a decision to greenlight the death of a man he'd known since that man was a teenager, all without ever once putting his own name on a piece of paper that could send him to prison faster than the 50 years it actually took. Anthony Corallo, the boss Vario served under after his release in 1975, was eventually convicted in the same wave of RICO prosecutions that dismantled most of the Five Family's leadership through the 1980s. And by the time Vario died in 1988, the Lucchese family he'd spent his life building inside looked nothing like the organization he'd joined as a young man. The informants kept talking after Henry Hill. The wiretaps kept running. The structure that had once depended on nobody ever putting anything in writing collapsed under the weight of men who'd finally decided prison time wasn't worth the loyalty anymore. Vario didn't live to see how completely that world came apart. He died believing, as far as anyone can tell, that he'd played the whole thing about as well as it could be played, and in a narrow sense he had. He turned an 11-year-old cab stand kid into 30 years of federal testimony, and it still took the government most of his adult life to put him away for good. Karen Hill's video told you what it was like to live inside that world as the wife who watched her husband transform in front of her, and then watched her own marriage survive an affair with the very man running the operation. This is the same set of years, the same house, the same betrayal, but seen from the man who held every piece of power in the room. He wasn't a background character, keeping the peace between more interesting men. He was the reason there was a Henry Hill story to tell at all, because he's the one who picked an 11-year-old off a Brooklyn sidewalk and decided he was worth keeping. If this one connected for you, go back and watch the Karen Hill video next to it. Same house, same years, completely different vantage point. Subscribe if you want more of these real history breakdowns tied to the movies that made these names famous. And tell us in the comments which real mobster behind a classic film deserves the next full episode.